pleasure to be here and to share with you this the content of this seminar. Just a couple of words before I share my slides and I lose the the vision of your faces. So because of this and because the seminar is thought to be interactive, please feel free to comment and share views by simply speaking out, because I will not be able to see comments in the chat before the end, at the end of the seminar. Why I am presenting this type of content today? Because of what Omar said presenting me. So I have a background of research in automotive and vehicle control, mobility systems, and so on, and a strong commitment to civic engagement and equal opportunities. So I reflected a lot in the past years on how to bridge these two elements. So how I could bring my, let's say, civic engagement into research. And I started reflecting on diversity-aware technologies. And of course, the immediate application field for me was mobility. So now I have a rather large research group of people working on this topic and several collaboration also with philosophers of science and people from the humanity field to work together on this topic. So you will see that it's let's say a seminar that is maybe not so expected from a control viewpoint, but I brought, so the idea is to understand how to bring also quantitative elements into what is called the socio-technical problem. So a mix of technique, technology, and the impact that technology has on its users and on society at large. Okay, so I will now share my screen with the slides. Okay, now they should be full screen for you. Is that so?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Yes.
Okay, so I did already the introduction, so this is the agenda. So we'll start reflecting a bit on the moral value of technological mediation, which is, according to me, the main motivation that should bring, let's say, the reflection for us who are we are mostly engineers and designers of technology. So why we should not overlook the social impact of technology because of this concept of technological mediation. After having reflected together a bit on that, I will say a few words on how we are considering this issue now at Politecnico di Milano, and let's say putting it in practice by working on inclusive technology and technology for inclusion, and finally giving you a glimpse on the specific issue of how to bring it on the table for mobility solutions. Okay, so I start with a question. Of course, feel free to speak out because I'm not seeing you anymore. So these are, let me say, very passive technological things. So these overpasses, which let me see if I can. Okay, so overpasses. You see here 3 different pictures of overpasses in streets. So could you tell me which is the one of the elements? So why are these overpasses different one from the other? Of course, in principle, they are the same thing, but they are different one from the other. So what is different among these 3 overpasses?
Is the height of the bridge like overpass?
Right, right. You picked it at the first attempt. So super good. Yes, it's the height of the overpass. So you can see that the arc, of course, which is characteristic of all overpasses, is different in height in the three of them. So what is the implication of setting a height for an overpass? What are you controlling when you define the height of an overpass?
Who can goes under that
Exactly.
overpass?
You are controlling and determining and choosing who is going to pass. So who is going to benefit of your overpass? This is exactly the point. I took the overpass as an example because in the late 1800s, a very influential and contested urban planner, Robert Moses, designed overpasses in the streets around Long Island in New York. And he designed overpasses over the parkways, and he established, with having chosen the height of these overpasses, that they should have been too low to let buses pass below them, meaning that only people with cars could pass below. And so who were the people with cars? Mostly white and affluent people at that time in Long Island. And so African Americans who mostly moved on buses, or anyway, the low end, economically speaking, part of the population could not reach the beaches. And so they were called later in the history of urban planning, racist overpasses. Because by setting the height, implicitly, the urban planner was deciding who could and who could not access the beaches via passing below these overpasses. So this is something I think we should think about, because there is nothing in our head of engineers, but anyway, in the sensitivity of also, common people, more passive than an overpass. So it's stone put there. So it's not so easy to reflect and to understand that ethics and decisions, and so morality, because behind any decision there is a moral principle, can be embedded also into passive artifacts. And so I think we can now agree that we can state that artifacts are bearers of morality because they take decisions for people. So just to keep on the, on the mobility context and using very passive things as examples. So think of a street bump. Street bumps are, again, another type of artifact that we have in our street. That, of course, imply that we need to slow down before passing on the bump. And so the moral decision that decides how fast I should drive can be delegated to a speed bump, because the speed bump is an artifact, but it tells somehow to the drivers, be careful to slow down before reaching me. Of course, what happens if you do not slow down? That you damage your car. So it's a very strong and direct consequence and loss, economic loss and whatever. So you are directly hit very precisely by not following this moral implication. So the implication is moral because it should tell you not to drive fast, because driving fast can put other people at danger. But why do you actually slow down? mostly because if you do not, you damage your car. Of course, in principle, the moral decision could have been conveyed also by putting a chart, by putting a sign on the street, a speed limit. But why are we using bumps? Because speed limits do not get the same effect on drivers. So on the one hand, there is the morality of artifacts. On the other hand, there is the different reaction to this moral message that depends on the sensitivity of the users. And in general, speaking, at large, if the user does not have any inconvenience responding, let's say, correctly to the moral suasion, then maybe this moral message is not passing very well. And the comparison between speed bumps and speed and the street signs is a very nice example to understand it. Okay, so the concept of technological mediation. It's a phenomenon that says that when technology fulfill their functions, they also help to shape actions and perceptions of their users. We can stay with the passive technology of the speed bump. So when a speed bump fulfills its function, it shapes action, so it makes me drive at lower speed, and possibly also helps me perceiving the increased safety in driving more slowly. So this means that technologies are not neutral intermediaries between the users and the environment, because as we use the technology and as technology fulfills its specific roles, it changes behaviors. And in changing behaviors, it changes perception. And if you think now, if we zoom out of our speed bump, and if you jump thinking of artificial intelligence, for example, you understand how many implications of these being intermediates between users and environments pop up. Is there any comment? Because I heard some voices. Okay. So technology, sorry?
No, I think it was just someone with the microphone open.
Okay, no problem. Okay, so technologies and technological artifacts are impactful mediators. And they shape, of course, how people use technologies, but most of all, how they experience the world through the use of technologies. Here I put a very super simple intermediary, which are glasses. Of course, very simple glasses. Of course, they change the way in which we see the world through their lenses. And again, this is can be thought as a as a metaphor for any type of technology. According to the field of technology, technology works as a pair of glasses does for our view. And as we have seen from super passive urban technologies such as the speed bump to the use of artificial intelligence that is behind everything today, we are experiencing this mediation. So of course now I have put you in the place of the users to start reflecting on these. But then if you think of us, of yourself as a technology designer, then I think you should agree on the fact that you cannot leave out of your field of interest and of professionalism a thought on this. Because you are designing technologies, of course, you are thinking of a specific function that your technology has to fulfill, but you cannot overlook the fact that you are shaping a mediation between the user and the world through your technology. And so you should look carefully to which type of mediation you are constructing, let's say, and which are the moralizing principles that can be behind your technology. We have seen that choosing a rather simple and I would say, again, passive parameters such as the height of the overpass, you have huge social implications. So, of course, the more technology grows, the more digital they become, the more intelligent, in quotes, they are, the more numerous these mediations can become. And I think it's a very fascinating things for us as technology designers, because today I think that people who design technology has the moral and the social levers in our society. The problem is that we are not trained to manage these levers, sometimes not even to understand that these levers are there. And so it's very important to reflect. It's very important to work with colleagues who are studying these things and start working to talk to each other and understand together these issues and put them into practice for the best final outcome. Okay, so again, on these moralizing technologies, we can say now that many of our actions and as a consequence, interpretations of the world, also moral interpretations, are co-shaped by technologies. Think, for example, to artificial intelligence in social media and the suggestions that they give you based on your past use of the technology itself. People that they think you should meet, products that they think you should see, groups that they suggest you should enter, and so on and so forth. These are super mediations into your inner and most intimate life. And these are co-shaped by technologies. But users, and I contend sometimes also technology designers, are not very aware of this. So moral decision-making is a joint effort of human beings and technological artifacts. So putting this in the active sense, moralization of technology is the deliberate development of technologies in order to shape moral action and decision-making. So this is something that we can bring on our table and consider as a very important part of the technology that we are designing. Think of now let's go way back to allegedly passive things and think of metro barriers. In every city where there is a metro station, there are some kinds of barriers. In Milano, for example, there are physical barriers. So there are, metal bars that, of course, you can jump on, and some people do, but these bars open only if you have a ticket and if you present a ticket to the digital interface at the barrier. So what is the moral action that they want to shape? If I put a metro barrier, I tell my users buy a ticket before you enter the subway. It's not right to use the subway service without paying. This is the moral action that I want to shape. Of course, there are different metro barriers. It's a bit of the same as the, choosing between a speed bump and the road sign. I can simply put cards that say subway can be accessed only with a ticket, and then no physical barriers, but just, let's say, moral suasion, or physical barriers that open up only presenting the ticket physically. And these barriers can be overcomable, as it is in Milano with our, horizontal bar. You can see very often people jumping up or passing down the bars. And so actually choosing not to behave morally, with morally is defined by the message of the barrier. If you go in northern countries, at least in Europe, the more you are in the north, the more the barriers are shaped as a moral suasion. The more you come to the south, the more the barrier becomes physical. This is also an interpretation of the population given by, accepted widely, so widely that it permeates choices such as the shape of these barriers. Okay, so I think that for us working in digital technology and at large artificial intelligence, or anyway in any type of technology that has, is intended for some type of users, so we should move from a passive responsibility to an active responsibility. So the passive responsibility means that responsibility is connected to being held accountable for your action and for the effect of your action. Making choices, taking decisions, failing to act, and so on. So passive responsibility is a bit backward looking. So something undesirable occurs. So let me see who is responsible for this bad outcome, who I can claim responsibility on. Active responsibility means thinking in advance, so understanding these implications and making them levers of design, so preventing the negative effects of technology, or also realizing positive effects by taking specific design choices that may seem also a bit unrelated to the main goal that the technology has, but can have loads of meaning when we look at the moralization effort and mediation, technological mediation, as we discussed. Sometimes let's say the concept of performance and the concept of moralization intertwine a lot, and so I have to trade off between the two. We will see it a bit of this in practice in the final part of the talk. Any comments on this first part before I jump to the second? Okay, so what are we doing at Politecnico di Milano to consider the context that I introduced before? So the mission that our current rector, Professoressa Donatella Asciuto, has given to our university at the start of her rectorate 3 years ago, she has asked the Politecnico to distinguish itself by its ability to tackle the main scientific and technological challenges according to an ethical dimension that interprets and declines the very concept of sustainability as a synonym for equity, inclusion, and shared growth. So the message that our rector gave to us is to be very attentive to this technological mediation and to interpret the main word of sustainability as a synonym for equity, inclusion, and shared growth. This took practice by considering people and inclusion, diversity, and well-being as a main pillar for our actions, next to the classical university missions of education, research, and social responsibility. So understanding that our university as society at large is made by people, and unless our people is included, is diverse, and feels well working in our institution, or the other missions will be, of course, undermined by a lack of inclusion, diversity, and well-being. And again, to put this into practice, a strategic orientation for our university is to become one of the leading universities in the development of inclusive technologies. This responds again to a priority of inclusion and equal opportunities, together with innovation and social responsibility. And when you think of inclusive technologies, there are two main let's say, families of actions that you can look at and that you can take. One is to work on technologies for inclusion, and one is to work on inclusive technologies. So let me just say a few words to shape the difference between these two main fields. So technology for inclusion is maybe, you know, the more direct image that you can figure out for yourself when you think on how technologies can promote inclusion. So technologies can be seen as a means for ability augmentation. So I have my target user or a part of my target user who lack some type of ability, and I provide them with this ability through the use of technology. Examples of this type of projects, there are many currently active in Politecnico di Milano, of course in many different departments, mostly working together because these are natively interdisciplinary disciplines. So there's a project that worked on augmenting autonomy for people affected by autism through virtual reality, augmented reality, and conversational agents, so that people with this kind of difficulties could improve the autonomy in moving around the city. So chatbots for guiding them into buying tickets, suggestions, augmented maps, and so on and so forth. So the idea here was to provide an augmentation of the autonomy for people affected by autism. Again, here we are talking of robotics, so autonomous robots who interact again with the children, mostly with autism or other type of relational difficulty, to work on the expression of emotions. And finally, a road drone, a terrestrial drone, autonomous, that guides blind people or people with sight impairments around in the city. This is a project that has been carried out mostly with hospitals that partners, and this guy here guides blind or visually impaired people through their paths in the hospital. So of course, this is a very important way to look at technology. Another interesting thing is that, of course, when we think of these technologies, we have in mind a specific targets of people with difficulties, but we should not forget that there are many people, ourselves too, in the course of our lives, who incur in what is called temporary inability or situational inability. For example, when I drive a car, I have my sight that is 100% or should 100% used to look at the road. So in that moment, it's like I'm blind in the sense that if I have to receive the other inputs, they should use the remaining senses, but not the sight. So you understand that all technologies, all types of technologies that have been conceived having as target visually impaired people can be used for, let's say, people without visual impairments when they're driving, and so on and so forth. So the concept of situational disability is another very important way of exploiting technologies that have been at first conceived for some kind of disability to reach the general public. Okay, so this was technologies for inclusion. So adding abilities through the use of technologies. Then there is the other side of the coin, which is the side of inclusive technologies. So this is rethinking, technologies that may exist already, but understanding that their spread, their use, and so their design should be understood under a diversity-aware lens. Why should we do this? Because, of course, technology is experiencing now disruptive changes. The use of AI is the main one that everybody's talking about, but there are many other disruptive changes. And these new technologies that are changing will substantially alter the interactions between individual and society. Society too is changing. So we have the gender gap, the digital divide, aging, multiculturalism. So the user that is often seen as a monad, an indistinguished individual, instead must be understood through a diversity-aware lens, so that their different relevant dimensions that define the individual are taken into account together. This is called the intersectional sociological framework that basically accounts for the fact that each of us is the intersection of many different social dimensions. I have my gender, my sex and my gender identity, my age, my ethnicity, my class, where I live, and so on and so forth. The combination of these variables makes the single individual unique. And so I should think of my user, me being a technology designer, through this lens, because I must, intertwine the technology realities with the social realities. So I must understand the technology, as I was saying at the very beginning, as a socio-technical problem. Why should I do so? Here is just a visual incomplete recount on how many phases of our life can technology have a strong say on. So there is justice, there is, safety, let's say, through facial recognition. There is medical investigation, and so social health through, for example, machine learning for digital health-related imaging. And here, if you don't consider who are you taking images from, of course, you can make wrong diagnoses, wrong decisions, and so on and so forth. There's the whole world of autonomous cars, and how should I bring decision-making into the virtual driver? So this is a very important debate that is going on, and it's also something, especially the liability issues behind this type of decisions, that is, also slowing down the diffusion of this type of vehicles. So if I'm in an accident condition, what should I do? We all accept that human drivers, when they are in dangerous situation, tend to preserve their life, because the preservation of the life is one of the most, basic instinct that human beings and also animals have. So we don't attribute, let's say, a bad behavior to a human driver who, in a complicated situations with danger, takes the decision to save himself. But would we accept the same decision-making procedure from a virtual driver? So should it act trying to save itself, let's say, and by extension, the people in the car that it's driving? Or should it work to minimize the overall casualties in the accident? Who decides this? Because of course, then, people who are coding these rules in the system can provide, certainties that the code fulfills the specifications. But who gives the specifications? Which is the right behavior? It's a very difficult question to answer if you reflect on that. So there is a number of ethical issues related to automated decision making, so to the level of automation that we embed in our technology. Of course, there is privacy, security, trust, responsibility, justice, and fairness. Fairness is highlighted because it's the main driver that I am considering up to now in my research. So it's not the most important, but it's the one that I have taken in consideration because fairness means absence of biases in the decision. The bias can be conscious, can be unconscious, but bias is, what in general affects the most our decisions and remains more hidden and more difficult to agree upon with respect to the other issues, which are very complex, of course, but very, precisely defined. So in my research, when I think of and try to convey social justice elements in the technological design, I take the lens of fairness. And with this lens, I will take now you through a few words into the final part of the talk, so diversity-aware design of technology with a focus on mobility. So, of course, I don't need to convince you that mobility is super important in the sustainability discourse, but also I want you to reflect on the fact that to be effective in having impact and becoming sustainable, the new mobility models can be accepted by a large amount of people. And this large amount of people must accept to change their behaviors to adopt sustainable mobility models. And so there is a strong need to design inclusive mobility solutions that can be accepted by all individuals. And for doing so, I must account for individual diversity by looking at the socioeconomic factors that explain the individual behaviors, possibly beyond mobility habits. So how do we do this in our research group? We do this along three main pillars. So first of all, we want to understand what drives people to adopt innovative mobility solutions. So we study the socioeconomic drivers that determine the adoption of a technology. So I don't buy an electric vehicle just because of its technological specifications. But there is a price issue, a fashion issue, recognizability issues, many other factors that are not directly related to going from point A to point B with a means of transport. Then we recognize that people behave according to the social networks that they live within. So we must model the adoption process, understand it also in a social network. So by connecting individuals by some measures of proximity and understanding how these connections can impact the adoption process. And finally, when we actually have vehicles of services, we have to use the optimization degrees of freedoms that we have, for example, in HMIs, to personalize the vehicle to its final user, who actually is a unique person that will interact with it. So how do we do this? We do it in a data-driven, I would say, engineering like way and quantitative way. So we use data from surveys, from measurements, and we use machine learning to extract the socioeconomic factors that better drive the attitude of the users towards adoption. We connect the users in a network and we study the adoption process. There are formal mathematical models, graph-based models, that are used in the opinion dynamic fields that can be used for this. So you can simulate scenarios and mathematically characterize the response of the system. And you can also model how you shape and you define policies that can support adoption. In the sustainability field, it's super common that governments or institutional bodies put forward policies to foster sustainability habits, and we can show how to enforce fairness criteria in these policies so that we have a customized set of policies, and we can also show in simulation how effective they are in fostering adoption and ensuring fairness. And finally, when our users are using the system, we can, through sensors and interfaces, monitor the interactions and, create a feedback, adjusting the policies, the services, the products, and, constantly refining these three pillars pipeline. Just to give you an idea, of course, there are many things you can think of in the mobility context that are happening. So electric vehicles, sharing, autonomous driving, digital mobility, and of course, all these have tremendous social implications. So just to say a few words again on the three layers. So the attitude is studied by extracting from data the socioeconomic drivers that guide adoptions. We work finding compact indicators that we call the mobility DNAs to explain the characteristics of the users, and we can do clustering using this metric to understand how our users are divided into different families and get a realistic picture of the adoption process. Then we build these social networks and we connect users according to different proximity measures. So physical proximity, I look at my neighbor because I encounter him or her in my personal life. I have a social proximity. I have a class proximity, educational proximity, and so on and so forth. So you can build different social networks. And on this social network, understand which are the connections that matter the most in the opinion spread, and also using control theory tools, define policies and test the effectiveness of these policies on the network. Now, just a final word to give you a view on how we can bring social justice into the picture quantitatively. For example, let's consider that we want to enforce equality and equity in the making of our policies. So first of all, reflect that equality and equity are very different concepts. So equality means I give everybody the same support. Even if, like the big guy here, he would not need it to overcome the barrier. Because as you see here, he sees through even without help. Equity instead means shaping individual support differently across individuals to ensure equal access to the resource. So these are different concepts that can be used in policies with pros and cons, and that you may want to enforce when you define your policy. Let me just skip this to conclude the discourse on the equality and equity, so on social justice. So I don't want to go into the into the mathematical formulas, but I want just to show you that when you define a policy, you are basically solving an optimization problem. Cost-benefit trade-off. And in your benefit, you may want to insert social justice elements. This is the formal definition in a control-related optimization setting, but you can choose different settings, in which you can write down your cost functions, expressing equality and expressing equity. So you put these social concepts into math and into an optimization process. So you can perceive the difference in the final solutions and in the final scenarios that you get, considering explicitly this type of social effects. And I think this can be a very important tool to interact also with political stakeholders, to let them understand that these aspects can be introduced in an active responsibility context, as the one I mentioned before, and not just measuring in some naive way these concepts at the end of the process, when there is no more room or nearly no room to accommodate these aspects if they have not been met in the previous design. Just to close, of course, I have now introduced this concept of fairness from an economics perspective. So I share my resources according to equality and equity, for example. There is another very important aspect of fairness, which is the epistemic perspective. So which means that the discriminations in the social interaction can be another source of unfairness, because as this comic says in a humorous way, everybody can recognize that certain classes of people, women in a technological and scientific context, Afro-Americans in other contexts, young people in other contexts, are considered less than others. Their opinions are counted less than others because they share these socioeconomical factors. And so the influence that in our social network one agent has on his neighbors depends on this credibility. So how much they are understood, how much their opinion counts according to their social status, being young, being a woman, being Black, and so on and so forth. And we have found a way to put also these aspects into the math of our system. And of course, the results are very compelling in showing how much these social interactions can be shaped by discriminations. And this is another aspect that must be taken into account, especially in policy design. Of course, when you have designed all your systems and your vehicles and your service, of course, you have to offer each user a concrete solution which is perceived as diversity aware. So you can, again, leverage the degrees of freedom that you have in your vehicle or in your service to understand the specific needs and preferences of the final user and do some personalization, customization of the final solution so that it perfectly adheres to the specific individuals, which of course, who of course is unique by nature. Okay, this concludes my talk. We have a few minutes left for comments, which I hope some of you have. And thank you very much for the attention. Mara.
Yes, thank you for your talk. It was really very interesting, and it brought me to think to have a different approach to see things clearly, because we give it for granted, but then if you start thinking about it, then you find out that there are some concepts that you might not have taken into consideration. My question is, when this kind of mixed approach, the ethical perspective to mobility started to take place in the society, I would say, I mean, at policy making level, because I mean, it's something so natural, so, I mean, basic that we should consider, but we have seen, and as in your examples, that it took a while before all these considerations started to take place, honestly. So when
it's still quite a bit not taken into account, at least at the political level. If you think, most of the governments, at least on electric vehicles, made pricing policies. So you got an electric vehicles instead of a combustion one, and you got a discount. At least in Italy it was like that, but in many countries it was like that. And this discount affected any user whatsoever. So basically it means a discount for those people for whom the price barrier, which is an important barrier for electric vehicles still nowadays, was not a big deal. So I could buy it and I get a discount. Nice. For those who, are far below the threshold, the price barrier, that the discount was not enough. So this was an example of using equality as a metric. So I give everybody the same support, but it resulted in a very elitarian solution. In fact, at least in Italy, electric vehicles are the nice addendum for rich people who have big combustion cars, but they like the flavor of urban electric cars. That's the reality. So that's an example of a technological solution that could have brought sustainability improvements, but did not, because it didn't make it a massive solution. And it's the same as, for example, when they determine the prices of public transportation. Here there are some segmentations, elderly people, young people who have helps in accessing these services. But this structured planning type of things has not yet taken over. Also because, at least in Italy, political decision-making is in general made by people who is not quantitative at all.
That was my feeling indeed. Yeah, and my second question is, how is Italy positioned in this new sort of science science, let's call it, mixed science, mobility and ethical aspects and so on, because I always like to see how far we are, because usually we are not the first one in the row when we have to, start doing new things or new approaches. So what is the situation, at least around Europe?
Scientifically, things are moving, and Italy is active, of course, in this field. I think now it's the matter of being able of taking it a step further. So being able to actually interact with stakeholders and let them understand that these things can be made quantitative. Of course, it's not their duty to make them quantitative, but their duty is to inspect, because the power of this approach is that you can experiment at design time. Of course, you are experimenting on a net that is not fully representative of your population, but if you don't take into account the absolute numbers, but the variations of the numbers in different scenarios, then the variations can be representative. And this is something that you can discuss and take into account when you design things before deployment. And so this is an interesting thing.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Any other questions? So, someone asked Mara if it's possible to have the presentation.
Yes, I will make the PDF and share it with you, Omar and Mara, and then you can share it with the audience. Sure.
Amazing then. Thank you so much, Mara Tanelli, Professor Tanelli. Thank you so much, Mara Tumiati and Stefano Sanna.
Yeah, because it's a very strange presence of two Maras, which is very strange because nobody has this name usually.
And then thank you to all of you for attending the workshop. We hope you enjoyed it, and then you will have access to the presentation and register the recording of this workshop. So thank you so much, and have a nice day.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks, bye.
See?